The autumn rain fell steadily upon the Burgundy countryside, transforming the rolling vineyards into a patchwork of grey and amber that stretched toward distant hills shrouded in mist. Within the first-class compartment of the Paris-Dijon Express, Hercule Poirot sat with characteristic precision, his small hands folded atop the head of his walking stick, his magnificent moustache groomed to absolute perfection, despite the damp weather. The letter that had summoned him lay on the seat beside him, its elegant script and heavy paper speaking of old money and older traditions. The missive had come from Comte Philippe de Valmont, proprietor of Château Valmont, one of the most celebrated wine estates in all of France. The Comte wrote that a matter of extreme delicacy required Poirot's immediate attention, a matter involving questions of authenticity, family honour, and potential criminal fraud that threatened to destroy a legacy spanning 3 centuries. The wine collection at Château Valmont was legendary, containing vintages dating back to the 17th century, bottles whose provenance had been meticulously documented through generations. But now, the Comte wrote, he had reason to believe that someone had been systematically replacing genuine bottles with clever forgeries, and that the perpetrator might be someone within his own household. Poirot had made certain discreet inquiries before accepting the invitation. What he learned had been most illuminating, though troubling. The Valmont family, while still possessed of considerable estates and an ancient name, had fallen upon difficult circumstances in recent years. The previous Comte, Philippe's father, had made a series of unwise investments in Russian bonds before the Revolution, losing a substantial portion of the family fortune. The wine collection represented not merely tradition and prestige, but also the family's greatest liquid asset, potentially worth millions of francs if properly authenticated and sold. More intriguing still were the whispers about internal family conflicts. Philippe de Valmont had married late in life, choosing as his bride not a woman of his own class, but rather the daughter of a successful Parisian wine merchant. This match had scandalized the family and estranged Philippe from his younger brother, Comte Henri, who had always considered himself the true guardian of the Valmont heritage. There were also questions about the estate's sommelier, one Monsieur René Beaumont, a man of extraordinary expertise but uncertain origins, who had served the family for 15 years and who possessed knowledge of the cellars that perhaps exceeded even that of the current Comte. As the train began to slow for the Valmont station, Poirot reflected that he was being summoned not merely to investigate a crime, but to navigate a web of family tensions, financial desperation, and wounded pride. The little grey cells, as he fondly termed his mental faculties, were already beginning to work, sorting through possibilities and probabilities, preparing for the task ahead. A motor car awaited him at the station, driven by a taciturn man in Valmont livery who spoke not a word during the 20-minute journey through increasingly rural countryside. The rain continued its steady fall, and as they turned through imposing iron gates and proceeded up a long drive lined with ancient oaks, Poirot caught his first glimpse of Château Valmont itself. The house was magnificent, in the French classical style, all pale stone and tall windows, with a slate roof that gleamed wetly in the grey light. The building dated from the early 18th century, Poirot knew, constructed on the site of an earlier medieval fortress. The symmetry of its facade pleased his orderly mind, but there was something about the place that suggested decay beneath the elegant surface, a subtle sense of neglect in the overgrown gardens and the crumbling stonework of the outbuildings. He was received at the entrance by the butler, an elderly man named Laurent, who had clearly served the family for many years, and who carried himself with the dignity of one who remembered better days. "Monsieur Poirot, we have been expecting you. The Comte is currently engaged with his wine merchant, but he asks that you refresh yourself after your journey and join the company for dinner at 7 o'clock. I shall show you to your chambers." The guest room to which Poirot was conducted was comfortable, if somewhat faded, its furnishings elegant but worn, its walls showing the rectangular shadows where paintings had once hung and presumably been sold to meet expenses. A fire had been lit against the damp chill, and Poirot's luggage had been unpacked with impressive efficiency. He took the opportunity to change from his travelling clothes into evening dress, to restore his moustache to perfection, and to contemplate the case before him. At precisely 7 o'clock, Poirot descended to the salon, where he found the household assembled. Comte Philippe de Valmont proved to be a man of perhaps 50, tall and spare, with the bearing of one who has been accustomed to command, but now finds his authority questioned. His face showed the lines of care and worry, and there was a tension in his shoulders that spoke of burdens carried too long. "Monsieur Poirot," the Comte said, advancing with hand extended, "I cannot adequately express my relief at your arrival. The situation has become increasingly dire, and I fear that we are running out of time before irreparable damage is done to my family's reputation." Beside him stood a woman of perhaps 35, handsome rather than beautiful, with intelligent eyes and a direct manner that suggested practical competence rather than aristocratic languor. This was clearly the Comtesse Isabelle, the wine merchant's daughter who had married above her station. "Monsieur Poirot, welcome to Château Valmont. I have read of your cases with great interest. I hope that you can bring clarity to this most distressing situation." The other members of the household were introduced in turn. Comte Henri de Valmont, Philippe's younger brother, was a man of perhaps 45, with a dissipated look, and the red-veined nose of one who had lived too well and too carelessly. His manner toward his brother and sister-in-law was correct, but cold, suggesting old grievances insufficiently healed. "Monsieur Poirot, your reputation precedes you. Though I must confess I find it odd that my brother feels the need to involve an outsider in what should remain a family matter." Dr. Jean-Baptiste Moreau, the family physician, was a man of perhaps 60, with the gentle manner and tired eyes of one who has dedicated his life to healing. He greeted Poirot courteously, but with an air of distraction, as if his thoughts were elsewhere. With him was his daughter, Mademoiselle Claire Moreau, a quietly beautiful woman in her late 20s who carried herself with the reserved dignity of one who understood her place in the social order, but resented it nonetheless. The most striking figure in the room was Monsieur René Beaumont, the estate's sommelier and cellar master. He was perhaps 50, compact and precise in his movements, with the air of one who has dedicated his entire existence to the mastery of a single art. His hands were those of an artist, his nose was that of a bloodhound, and his eyes held an intensity that suggested both passion and perhaps something darker. When introduced to Poirot, he bowed with European formality, but said little, his gaze constantly returning to the Comte as if awaiting instructions, or perhaps judgment. Finally, there was Monsieur Armand Duchamp, a Parisian wine dealer and authenticator who had arrived 2 days previous to conduct a comprehensive examination of the Valmont collection. He was a plump man of perhaps 55, exquisitely dressed, with the smooth manner and calculating eyes of one who has made a fortune from the passions and pretensions of others. Monsieur Poirot, how delightful to make your acquaintance. I have long admired your work, though I must confess that I am surprised to find you involved in what is essentially a commercial matter, albeit one involving objects of considerable value. Dinner was served in the formal dining room, a magnificent chamber whose walls were hung with family portraits and whose table could have accommodated 20 guests with ease. The 8 diners gathered at one end seemed almost lost in the expanse, and the conversation, while polite, was strained. Poirot observed everything, his keen mind cataloguing details that others might have missed. The wine served with dinner was magnificent, a Château Valmont Premier Cru from 1900, and Beaumont presented each course of the meal with the reverence of a priest conducting a sacred ritual. Yet Poirot noted that while the wine itself was superb, the food was simple, almost Spartan, suggesting economies being practiced in the kitchen. He noted also that Comte Henri drank heavily, draining his glass with each course and reaching for the decanter with increasing frequency, while his brother Philippe barely touched his wine, his attention constantly drifting to the windows as if expecting unwelcome visitors. "You must understand, Monsieur Poirot," the Comte began once the soup had been served, "that the Valmont wine collection is not merely an assemblage of bottles. It is a living history of my family, a testament to 3 centuries of dedication to the art of viticulture. Each bottle represents not only the vintage of a particular year, but also the choices made by my ancestors, the wines they selected to lay down, the care with which they maintained the cellars. And yet," Armand Duchamp interjected smoothly, "history and tradition, while admirable, must ultimately bow to the hard realities of authentication and provenance. The market for rare wines has become increasingly sophisticated, and collectors demand ironclad proof of authenticity. A single, questionable bottle can cast doubt upon an entire collection." "Are you suggesting, monsieur, that you have found such questionable bottles?" Poirot asked mildly. Duchamp's expression became guarded. "I am suggesting only that the process of authentication is complex, and that one must examine every aspect of a bottle's provenance: the label, the cork, the glass itself, the ullage, the sediment. There are techniques now available that were not available even 20 years ago. Modern forgeries can be extraordinarily convincing." "But surely the Valmont cellars have been secure. Surely the bottles have remained untouched since they were laid down by previous generations." This from Claire Moreau, who had been following the conversation with evident interest. "Ah, mademoiselle, that is precisely the question," Comte Philippe said heavily. "The cellars have always been kept locked, and only 3 individuals possess keys: myself, my brother Henri, and Monsieur Beaumont. Yet somehow bottles have been tampered with. Labels have been carefully steamed off and reattached. Corks have been replaced. And I have reason to believe that some bottles have been entirely substituted with forgeries." "These are serious accusations, brother," Henri de Valmont said, his voice sharp with wine and anger. "You speak of tampering and forgery, yet you produce no proof. You summon this detective and this wine merchant to examine our family's treasures as if we were common criminals. Have you considered that your so-called discoveries might be nothing more than the paranoid fantasies of a man under financial strain?" The tension in the room became palpable. Philippe's face flushed with anger, but before he could respond, Comtesse Isabelle placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Gentlemen, please. We are all family here. Whatever difficulties we face, we must face them together with dignity and mutual respect." "Forgive me," Poirot interjected smoothly, "but I am perhaps not fully informed of all the circumstances. Comte Philippe, you mentioned in your letter that you had made certain discoveries. Perhaps you might elaborate on these for the benefit of all present?" Philippe collected himself with visible effort. "3 weeks ago, I was conducting an inventory of the cellars in preparation for Monsieur Duchamp's visit. As I examined the oldest section, where we keep the pre-revolutionary vintages, I noticed that one bottle, an 1788 Château Margaux that had been in my family since before the Terror, seemed lighter than it should have been. Upon closer inspection, I discovered that the wine level was lower than our records indicated it should be, suggesting that the bottle had been opened and then resealed. A single bottle might represent nothing more than natural evaporation over centuries," Duchamp observed. "But I assume there is more?" "Indeed. I began examining other bottles in that section more carefully. I found that several had been disturbed, that corks had been replaced with period-appropriate but not original corks, that labels showed signs of having been removed and reaffixed. Most disturbing of all, I found one bottle that was completely fraudulent, a supposed 1811 Comet vintage that, upon examination, proved to be filled with wine no older than 20 years. A shocked silence fell over the table. René Beaumont, who had been sitting very still during this recitation, finally spoke, his voice low and intense. "Monsieur le Comte, I must protest. You speak as if this discovery implicates me, but I have served your family with absolute loyalty for 15 years. I have guarded those cellars as if they were my own children. If someone has tampered with the collection, it was not I." "No one is accusing you, Beaumont," Philippe said, though his tone carried less conviction than his words. "But you must admit that the facts are troubling. You hold a key to the cellars. You have the expertise to create convincing forgeries. And I have learned that you have been seen in the company of certain Parisian wine dealers of dubious reputation." "I speak with many wine dealers," Beaumont said, his face pale now with anger or fear. "It is necessary for me to maintain contacts in the trade, to stay abreast of market conditions, to ensure that I can properly advise you on the management of the collection. But I have never betrayed your trust." "Perhaps," Poirot suggested gently, "we might continue this discussion after dinner, when emotions are not quite so elevated. For now, let us enjoy this magnificent meal and this superb wine. Tomorrow, with your permission, Comte Philippe, I should like to examine the cellars myself and to interview each member of the household privately. The truth, I assure you, will reveal itself if we but approach the matter with method and patience." The remainder of dinner proceeded in uncomfortable silence, broken only by desultory conversation about neutral topics. When the ladies rose to withdraw to the salon, leaving the gentlemen to their port, Poirot found himself studying his companions with renewed interest. Someone in this household was a thief and a forger. Someone with both the expertise and the access to carry out an elaborate fraud. But was it merely theft and fraud, or was there something darker at work? In the salon, the Comtesse played piano, while Claire Moreau turned pages, and the conversation revolved around safe topics. The weather, the grape harvest, plans for the autumn. But beneath the civilized veneer, Poirot sensed currents of tension, unspoken accusations, and suppressed fears. When he retired to his chamber at 10 o'clock, he did so with the conviction that this case was more complex than a simple matter of wine fraud, that there were depths here yet to be plumbed. He stood for a long time at his window, looking out over the darkened vineyards, watching the rain continue to fall. Somewhere in this ancient house, someone harbored secrets worth killing to protect. For Poirot's long experience had taught him that where there was fraud on such a scale, where family honor and fortune hung in the balance, violence was never far behind. And as if in response to his thoughts, he heard from somewhere deep within the chateau a cry of alarm, quickly stifled, that sent him hurrying from his room with his dressing gown clutched about him. The morning after the disturbing cry in the night, which had proven to be a servant startled by a rat in the corridor, dawned grey and damp, with fog rolling through the valleys and clinging to the ancient stones of Château Valmont like a shroud. Poirot breakfasted early and alone, noting with his characteristic attention to detail that the coffee was excellent, but the bread rather stale, another small sign of the economies being practiced in this grand but impoverished household. At 9 o'clock precisely, Comte Philippe met him in the library, a magnificent room lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes, many of them no doubt as valuable as the wines in the cellars below. The Comte looked as though he had not slept well, his face drawn and his movements nervous. "Monsieur Poirot, I must apologize for last night's disturbance. The servants have been on edge since this business began, seeing threats in every shadow. But I am grateful that you are here. I confess that I lie awake at night, wondering if I am doing the right thing, if I should simply sell the collection en masse and be done with it, regardless of the questions of authenticity." "And why do you not do so, if I may ask?" Poirot inquired gently. "Because, Monsieur Poirot, this collection is not simply mine to dispose of as I wish. It is a trust, handed down through generations. My father spent his life building and maintaining it, my grandfather before him. To sell it under a cloud of suspicion, to allow it to be dispersed with questions unanswered about which bottles are genuine and which are forgeries, it would be to betray everything my family has stood for." "I understand. Now, I should like to see these cellars, if you please, and I should like Monsieur Beaumont to accompany us. His expertise will be invaluable, and I wish to observe his reactions to certain questions I shall pose." The wine cellars of Château Valmont were reached through a heavy oak door at the rear of the house, down stone steps worn smooth by 3 centuries of use. The air grew progressively cooler and damper as they descended, until Poirot found himself in a vast subterranean space, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadow, its walls lined with racks upon racks of bottles that glimmered in the light of the oil lamps that René Beaumont lit as they progressed. "You see before you, Monsieur Poirot, the accumulation of 300 years," Beaumont said, and despite his evident tension, his voice carried a note of pride and even reverence. "Each section is organized by vintage and region. Here," he gestured to their right, "we have the Burgundies, arranged chronologically from the present day back to the 17th century. There," pointing left, "the Bordeaux, similarly arranged. And in the far corner, the rarest treasures of all, the pre-revolutionary vintages that survived the terror only through the courage and cunning of the then Comte, who hid them in a secret room that the revolutionaries never discovered. Poirot moved slowly through the aisles, his sharp eyes examining everything. The bottles lay in neat rows, each one carefully positioned and labelled. Dust lay thick upon most of them, the accumulation of decades or even centuries undisturbed. But, as Philippe had indicated, there were signs of disturbance if one knew where to look. Footprints in the dust, showing that someone had recently accessed certain sections. Bottles that sat slightly askew in their cradles, and, here and there, barely visible unless one looked closely, the telltale signs of tampering. Labels that had been carefully steamed and reaffixed, corks that did not quite match the age of the bottles they sealed. "Monsieur Beaumont," Poirot said suddenly, "you have been sommelier here for 15 years, you say? Tell me, in that time, has anyone else been granted access to these cellars?" Beaumont's expression became guarded. "Only Monsieur le Comte and his brother. Occasionally, Comtesse Isabelle, though she has less interest in the wines than in the accounts and the estate management. And of course, from time to time, wine merchants or experts come to examine specific bottles when the Comte considers selling them." "And how often does the Comte consider selling bottles from the collection?" Philippe answered this himself, his voice heavy with regret. "More often than I would wish, Monsieur Poirot. The financial realities of maintaining an estate of this size in modern times are harsh. Each year I have been forced to sell a portion of the collection to meet expenses. It pains me greatly, but what choice do I have?" "And who arranges these sales?" "I work with several dealers in Paris and London. Monsieur Duchamp has been my primary contact for the past 5 years. He authenticates the bottles, finds buyers, and arranges the transactions. It was he, in fact, who first raised questions about the authenticity of certain bottles when I approached him about a significant sale I was contemplating." "Ah, most interesting. And this significant sale, it would have involved bottles from this pre-revolutionary section?" "Yes. I had thought to sell perhaps 50 bottles, enough to clear my debts and provide working capital for necessary improvements to the estate. But Duchamp's examination revealed problems with several of the bottles I had selected, which is when I began my own investigation and made the disturbing discoveries I wrote to you about." Poirot had moved to the section containing the oldest bottles. He examined several closely, his small, precise hands handling them with the care of one who understood their value and fragility. Then, quite suddenly, he stopped before one particular bottle, a dark green glass that bore a faded label proclaiming it to be a 1784 Château Lafite. "This bottle," he said quietly. "Tell me about this bottle." Beaumont came forward, his face showing surprise. "That is one of our treasures, Monsieur Poirot, a pre-revolutionary Lafite, one of only 3 in the collection. Its value is difficult to estimate, but certainly 50,000 francs, perhaps more. Why do you ask?" "Because, mon ami, this bottle is not what it appears to be. Observe, the label has been carefully aged and distressed, but the paper itself is not 18th century stock. The cork, while old, is not original to the bottle. And most telling of all, the dust upon the bottle is inconsistent. It has been cleaned and then artificially redusted to match its neighbors." A shocked silence fell. Philippe de Valmont's face went white. You are certain? But I handled that bottle myself only last month when I was creating the inventory for Duchamp. I noticed nothing amiss. Because, Monsieur le Comte, you were not looking with the eyes of one who expects deception. You assumed that the bottle was what it appeared to be because it had always been so. But I assure you, this is a forgery. And a clever one, but a forgery nonetheless. René Beaumont had gone very still, his face unreadable. If what you say is true, Monsieur Poirot, then someone has perpetrated a sophisticated fraud. But I must ask, how do you know these things? You are a detective, not a wine expert. How can you be so certain of your conclusions? Poirot smiled thinly. Because, Monsieur Beaumont, while I am indeed not a wine expert, I am an expert in deception. And this bottle whispers to me of deception most elaborate. But we shall know with certainty soon enough. I suggest that we remove this bottle to the laboratory, where Monsieur Duchamp can conduct a thorough analysis. If I am correct, we will find that the wine inside is considerably younger than 1784. But the implications, Philippe exclaimed. If this bottle is false, how many others might be? My God, the entire collection could be compromised. The scandal would ruin us, destroy everything my family has built. Or, Poirot said quietly, we might find that this is the only forgery, carefully placed to deceive or to test. That is what we must determine. But first, I should like to ask some questions of each member of your household, Monsieur le Comte. With your permission, I shall conduct interviews in the library this morning, and I would ask that no one discuss what we have discovered here until I have had the opportunity to speak with everyone. The interviews proceeded throughout the morning, each revealing layers of complexity and suggestion, but nothing that constituted definitive proof. Comtesse Isabelle proved to be a woman of considerable intelligence and practical sense, who made no secret of her belief that the collection should be sold entire to solve the family's financial problems. I married Philippe understanding the burden he carries, she said frankly. But I did not marry him to watch him destroy himself, trying to maintain a legacy that no longer serves any useful purpose. The world has changed, Monsieur Poirot. The old ways no longer suffice. Comte Henri was bitter and defensive, making no secret of his resentment toward his brother and sister-in-law. Philippe always was father's favourite, he said, his words slightly slurred despite the early hour. Everything came to him. The title, the estate, the collection. And what was left for me? A small allowance, a suite of rooms in what should have been my ancestral home, and the constant reminder that I am the lesser son. Is it any wonder that I might wish to see the collection sold, the proceeds divided, the burden lifted? Dr. Moreau professed to know little of the wine business, though he admitted that he had often been present in the cellars when attending to various members of the family. I have known the Valmonts all my life, he said quietly. I delivered Philippe and Henri, watched them grow to manhood. I have served 3 generations of this family. Whatever troubles them now, I wish only to see them resolved with minimal damage to all concerned. His daughter Claire was more circumspect, but Poirot detected an undercurrent of strong feeling beneath her reserved exterior. I have had occasion to learn something of wines, Monsieur Poirot, she admitted. My father's position brings us into contact with the family's affairs, and I have assisted Monsieur Beaumont on several occasions with cataloguing and record-keeping. I find the subject fascinating, though I am hardly an expert. And have you observed anything unusual in your work with Monsieur Beaumont? Any irregularities or suggestions of impropriety? She hesitated before answering. I hesitate to speak ill of anyone, Monsieur Poirot, but I have noticed that Monsieur Beaumont has been increasingly anxious in recent months. He spends long hours in the cellars, far more than his duties would seem to require. And I have seen him in conversation with certain individuals in the village whose reputations are not altogether respectable. Armand Duchamp, when interviewed, was smooth and professional, but Poirot detected a certain calculation behind his affable manner. I make my living authenticating and selling rare wines, Monsieur Poirot. It is a business that requires both expertise and discretion. When Comte Philippe approached me about a significant sale, I naturally conducted a thorough examination. What I discovered troubled me greatly. Not because I suspected anyone in particular, but because the implications for the collection's reputation were so severe. A single proven forgery can destroy the market value of an entire collection. And tell me, Monsieur Duchamp, in your examination of the collection, have you found other bottles that concern you besides those the Comte mentioned? Duchamp's eyes became hooded. I have found several bottles whose provenance I would wish to examine more thoroughly, but I have not completed my analysis. These things take time, Monsieur Poirot. One cannot rush the process of authentication. No, indeed, but one can perhaps delay it if one has reasons for wishing to do so. I do not take your meaning, monsieur. Do you not? Let me be frank, Monsieur Duchamp. You profit from the sale of wines, do you not? And the greater the uncertainty about authenticity, the lower the price a seller must accept, and the greater the margin for a dealer who can later resell after confirming authenticity through his own channels. It is a most profitable arrangement, is it not? Duchamp's affable mask slipped, revealing for just a moment something harder and more calculating beneath. You are suggesting that I would deliberately create doubt about a collection in order to purchase it cheaply. That is a serious accusation, Monsieur Poirot, and one I strongly resent. I suggest nothing, monsieur. I merely observe that you would not be the first dealer to employ such tactics, and that human nature being what it is, we must consider all possibilities. The interview concluded shortly thereafter, but Poirot felt certain that he had struck a nerve. Duchamp bore watching, as did they all. It was René Beaumont's interview, however, that proved most illuminating. The sommelier was clearly under tremendous strain, his hands trembling slightly as he settled into the chair across from Poirot in the library. His eyes were bloodshot, suggesting sleepless nights, and there was a desperation in his manner that had not been evident the previous evening. Monsieur Poirot, he began without preamble, I must speak frankly with you. My position here has become untenable. I am suspected of crimes I did not commit, accused without evidence, tried without defense. And yet I cannot entirely blame the Comte for his suspicions, because I have kept certain facts from him. Facts that, if revealed, might clear me, but would destroy someone I care for deeply. Ah, Poirot said softly. And this person you care for, would that be Mademoiselle Claire Moreau, by any chance? Beaumont's eyes widened. How did you... But of course, you are a detective. You observe such things. Yes, Claire and I have formed an attachment, though we have kept it secret. Her father would not approve, and the Comte... Well, the Comte has other ideas for her future, I think.
And this secret attachment, it has bearing on the matter of the forged wines?
It has bearing on why I have been so distracted in recent months, why I have not been as vigilant in guarding the cellars as I should have been. Claire and I have been meeting secretly, often in the village, sometimes in the cellars themselves after hours. During those times, the cellars were left unguarded. The keys were out of my possession. Anyone could have accessed them.
Anyone? Or someone specific whom you suspect?
Beaumont hesitated, clearly torn between loyalty and honesty. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I have seen Comte Henri in the cellars at odd hours, times when he had no legitimate reason to be there, and I have noticed that certain bottles have gone missing after his visits. Bottles whose loss would not be immediately noticed because they were duplicates or lesser vintages. I said nothing because he is the Comte's brother, because I did not wish to cause trouble, because I had no proof. But now, with these accusations against me, I wonder if I have been protecting the wrong person.
You have evidence of these visits by Comte Henri?
Only my own observations and certain entries in the logbook that I maintain. He signs in when he visits, as protocol requires, but the timing and frequency, they are suspicious, are they not?
Most suspicious indeed. And tell me, Monsieur Beaumont, you are an expert in wines, capable of creating convincing forgeries?
I have the knowledge, yes. Any sommelier of my experience would, but having the knowledge and employing it for criminal purposes are very different things. I swear to you, Monsieur Poirot, I have not tampered with the collection. My entire professional reputation depends on my integrity. If I were to be exposed as a forger, I would be ruined, unable to work in my profession ever again. What possible motive would I have for taking such a risk?
But there you touch upon the heart of the matter. For someone has taken that risk. Someone with both the expertise and the access. And if not you, then who? That is what we must determine.
The conversation concluded with Beaumont's promise to provide Poirot with the logbooks and any other documentation that might prove relevant. As the sommelier departed, Poirot sat in thought for a long time, his fingers steepled before him, his eyes half closed in concentration. The little grey cells were hard at work, sorting through facts and impressions, discarding irrelevancies, focusing on what truly mattered. Luncheon was a subdued affair, with conversation notably absent. Poirot observed that Comte Henri did not attend, sending word that he was indisposed. This absence was noted by all, but remarked upon by none, and the constraint in the atmosphere grew more pronounced. After the meal, Philippe drew Poirot aside. Monsieur Poirot, Duchamp has completed his initial analysis of the bottle you identified this morning. You were correct. The wine is at most 20 years old, not from 1784. This is catastrophic. If one of our most prized bottles is a forgery, how many others might be compromised? And more to the point, who could have done this? That, Monsieur le Comte, is precisely what I intend to discover. But I must ask, has your brother Henri shown unusual interest in the collection recently? Philippe's expression became guarded. Why do you ask? Because, Monsieur, I have reason to believe that he has been accessing the cellars at irregular hours. Monsieur Beaumont has provided me with certain documentation that suggests frequent visits by your brother, visits whose purpose is not immediately clear. Henri has always loved the collection, perhaps more than I do, Philippe said slowly. He was father's companion in the cellars, learning the vintages, studying the provenance. When father died and left everything to me as the elder son, Henri was devastated. Not by the loss of the estate or even the title, but by the loss of his role as guardian of the wines. He felt, and perhaps rightly, that father had betrayed him. Sufficient motive, perhaps, for revenge? For damaging the collection that he felt should have been his to protect? You think Henri is the forger? But why would he harm the very thing he loves? Ah, but would he see it as harm? Or might he see it rather as justice, as a way of forcing you to relinquish what he believes should have been his by right? Consider, if the collection is shown to be compromised by forgeries, you would be forced to sell it, would you not? And in that sale, perhaps there would be an opportunity for Henri to acquire certain bottles for himself, to become their guardian, as he always wished to be. Philippe considered this, his face troubled. It is possible, I suppose, but Henri, for all his faults, is not a criminal. He would not stoop to forgery and deception, would he? Before Poirot could respond, a commotion erupted in the hallway. They heard running footsteps, a woman's scream, and then Claire Moreau burst into the room, her face white with terror. "Monsieur le Comte! Monsieur Poirot! You must come at once! There has been a terrible accident in the cellars. It is Monsieur Duchamp. I think he is dead!" They raced down the stone steps to the cellars, where they found Armand Duchamp lying motionless on the floor beside one of the wine racks. His face was contorted in an expression of agony, and a dark pool was spreading beneath his head where it had struck the stone floor. Nearby lay the shattered remains of a bottle, its contents seeping into the ancient dust, and the air was heavy with the scent of old wine mixed with something else, something acrid and wrong. Dr. Moreau arrived moments later and knelt beside the body, his professional manner masking whatever emotions he might feel. After a brief examination, he looked up, his face grave. "He is dead, I am afraid, and if I am not mistaken, the cause was not the blow to his head from the fall, though that certainly contributed. See here." He indicated Duchamp's lips, which showed a bluish tint. "And here," pointing to flecks of foam at the corners of the mouth. "These are signs of poisoning, and swift poisoning at that. And observe this wine glass." For indeed, there was a glass lying beside the body. "It still contains dregs that might tell us what he ingested." Poirot knelt beside the body, his sharp eyes missing nothing. "He came down here alone, it would seem. But why? And which wine did he drink that killed him? For I assume that the poison was in the wine." "That would be my assessment," Dr. Moreau confirmed. "But I cannot be certain without proper analysis. The symptoms suggest alkaloid poisoning, possibly strychnine or something similar." "Look here," Philippe said, his voice shaking. "This rack, these are the bottles from the pre-revolutionary section. And see, this gap. A bottle is missing. The bottle that killed him must have been one of these." Poirot examined the rack carefully. "Indeed. And observe this label that has fallen to the floor, torn from the bottle that shattered. What does it tell us?" Philippe picked up the fragment of label with trembling hands. "It is a 1788 Château Margaux. My God, one of our finest and rarest bottles, worth 10,000 francs at least. Why would anyone poison it? And how could Duchamp have been foolish enough to drink from it without proper examination?" "Ah, but that is most interesting, is it not?" Poirot said softly. "Consider, Duchamp was an expert, a man who would never casually drink from a bottle of such value without first ensuring its authenticity and condition. And yet, here he lies, poisoned by wine from our cellars. This suggests to me that he was not drinking casually, but rather testing, examining, conducting the very analysis that was his purpose in being here. Someone knew he would do this. Someone provided him with a specific bottle, knowing that his professional thoroughness would lead him to taste it. And someone filled that bottle with poisoned wine, instead of the genuine vintage it purported to be. "Murder," Philippe whispered. "You are saying this was murder, deliberately planned and executed?" "I am saying, Monsieur le Comte, that this was indeed murder, and murder most ingenious, for the killer has used the collection itself as a weapon, has turned your family's treasure into an instrument of death. And that tells us much about who might be responsible." "We must summon the police," Dr. Moreau said. "This is beyond our capacity to handle." "Of course," Poirot agreed. "But the nearest gendarmerie is in Dijon, and with these roads and this weather, it will be hours before they can arrive. In the meantime, I suggest that everyone retreat to the drawing room and that no one is permitted to leave the chateau. For among us is a murderer, someone who has killed to protect their secrets and who may kill again if we are not most vigilant." As the body was carefully carried upstairs and the household assembled in the drawing room under Poirot's direction, the Belgian detective stood for a moment alone in the cellars, his mind racing through possibilities. Who had killed Armand Duchamp, and why? Was it connected to the forgeries, or was there some other motive at work? And most pressingly, was anyone else in danger? The little grey cells worked furiously, sorting through facts and impressions, building theories and discarding them, seeking the pattern that would unlock the mystery. For Poirot knew from long experience that murder was never random, never without purpose. Someone in this house had determined that Duchamp must die, had planned the method with care, and had executed the plan with cold precision. And until he identified that person, everyone at Château Valmont remained in mortal danger. The drawing room at Château Valmont had been transformed into something resembling a court of inquiry, with the household assembled under circumstances that would have seemed absurd had they not been so grimly serious. Comte Philippe sat ashen-faced by the fire, while his wife hovered anxiously at his side. Comte Henri had finally emerged from his chambers, his dissipation now overlaid with evident shock. René Beaumont and Claire Moreau sat together, making no secret now of their attachment, while Dr. Moreau stood by the window, his physician's composure cracking to reveal the strain beneath. Poirot stood before them, his small figure commanding attention despite, or perhaps because of, his unprepossessing stature. His magnificent moustache was perfectly symmetrical, his posture erect, his manner grave but composed. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, "we are faced with a crime most serious, the murder of Monsieur Armand Duchamp. The police have been summoned, but until they arrive, we must take precautions. For we are not merely dealing with theft and forgery now, but with a killer who has shown themselves willing to use the most cold-blooded methods to protect their secrets." "But why would anyone kill Duchamp?" Philippe asked, his voice hollow. "What could he have discovered that was worth murder?" "Ah, but that is precisely the question we must answer. Let us consider what we know. Duchamp was an expert in wine authentication, brought here specifically to examine your collection and identify any forgeries. Yesterday, he conducted preliminary examinations and expressed concerns about certain bottles. This morning, I identified one bottle as definitely fraudulent. This afternoon, Duchamp was found dead in the cellars, poisoned by wine from a bottle that should have been genuine, but was not. The implication being that someone knew he was getting close to discovering the full extent of the fraud and killed him to prevent that discovery, Claire Moreau said quietly. Precisely, mademoiselle. But there is more. Consider the method of murder. To poison a wine bottle requires not merely access to poison, but also knowledge of which bottle Duchamp would examine next. This suggests that the killer knew his methods, knew his routine, perhaps even directed his attention to that specific bottle. You are suggesting that one of us is the murderer? Henri demanded, his face flushing. That is preposterous. We are families, not criminals. Are you not, monsieur? Then perhaps you can explain your frequent nocturnal visits to the cellars. Visits that Monsieur Beaumont has documented over the past several months. Visits during which bottles went missing or were disturbed. Henri's face went from red to white. I have every right to visit the cellars. They are my family's heritage as much as Philippe's. And yet you sign the logbook at odd hours. You access the oldest and most valuable sections. And you do so with a frequency that suggests something more than mere nostalgic interest. What were you doing there, Monsieur le Comte? The younger Valmont brother seemed to crumple before their eyes. Very well, he said heavily. I will tell you the truth. I have been removing bottles from the collection. Not to sell them for profit, though God knows I need money as much as Philippe does, but to save them, to preserve them from the disaster I saw coming. Explain yourself, brother, Philippe said, his voice cold. Don't you see? You were planning to sell the collection, to disperse it to the highest bidders, to scatter to the four winds what father and grandfather and all our ancestors had laboured to build. I could not allow it. So I took bottles, one by one, and I hid them away. I creates my own collection, my own cellar in the old wine press building that no one uses anymore. I meant to preserve our heritage, to keep it intact for future generations. And the forgeries? Poirot asked. Did you create those to replace the bottles you removed? No! I swear it! I simply took the bottles and left the gaps. If forgeries were placed in their stead, it was not by my hand. I am not a forger, Monsieur Poirot. Merely a desperate man trying to save what he loves. And yet, Poirot mused, you have admitted to theft, to deceiving your brother, to violating the trust of the household. And you have both the knowledge and the opportunity to have committed the forgeries as well. You see the difficulty of your position? Before Henri could respond, Claire Moreau rose to her feet, her face pale but determined. Monsieur Poirot, there is something I must tell you. I should have spoken earlier, but I was afraid. Afraid of the consequences. Afraid of betraying confidences. But now, with a man dead, I can remain silent no longer. Speak, mademoiselle. Truth, however unpleasant, is always preferable to protective silence. 3 weeks ago, I was working late in my father's study, organizing his medical journals. I heard raised voices from the library below. I should not have listened, I know, but I could not help overhearing. It was Monsieur Duchamp and Comte Henri, and they were arguing about wine. Duchamp accused Henri of approaching him months ago with a proposal to create forgeries of the rarest bottles in the collection, to substitute fakes for genuine bottles that Henri could then sell privately. He said he had refused, that he would not be party to such fraud. But Henri said that Duchamp was lying, that it was Duchamp himself who had proposed the scheme, offering to create the forgeries in exchange for a share of the profits from the sale of the genuine bottles. A shocked silence fell. All eyes turned to Henri, who had gone very white. "That is a lie," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "She is making it up, or she misheard, or—" "I think not, monsieur," Poirot said quietly. "I think that mademoiselle speaks the truth. And I think that this conversation she overheard may well be the key to understanding why Duchamp died. Tell me, Comte Henri, did Duchamp threaten to expose your scheme? Is that why he had to die?" "I did not kill him," Henri shouted, rising to his feet. "Yes, we had discussed creating forgeries. I am not too proud to admit that desperate times drive men to desperate measures. But I backed out. I refused to go through with it. I realized that I could not betray my family in such a way. Duchamp was furious, said I had wasted his time, that he would expose me unless I paid him for his silence. We argued about it in the library, as Mademoiselle Moreau has testified. But I did not kill him." "And yet," Poirot observed, "you had motive to do so. He was blackmailing you, threatening to destroy your reputation and your position in this family. How convenient it would be if he were to die before he could reveal your perfidy." "I am not a murderer," Henri insisted. "Yes, I am guilty of foolishness, of desperation, perhaps even of dishonor in entertaining such a scheme. But I did not create forgeries, and I certainly did not kill Armand Duchamp." "Then perhaps," said a new voice, "you can explain this." It was René Beaumont who spoke, holding up a small leather notebook. "I found this in Duchamp's room while searching for evidence of what he had discovered about the collection. It is his private journal, and it makes for most interesting reading. Would you like me to read the relevant passages, Monsieur Poirot?" "If you please, monsieur." Beaumont opened the journal and began to read. "September 15th. Met with H.V. today. He proposes that I help him create forgeries of the finest bottles in the collection, which he will then sell through my contacts while substituting the fakes. He offers me 40% of the proceeds. I have told him I need time to consider. The sum would be substantial, enough to retire comfortably, but the risk is considerable." October 3rd. Informed H.V. that I cannot participate in his scheme. Too dangerous, too unethical. He became quite agitated, threatened to find another forger, someone less scrupulous. I warned him that any such scheme would eventually be discovered, and that all involved would be ruined. October 20th. H.V. has approached me again, this time offering 50%. He is desperate, drowning in debts, apparently. I have refused again, more firmly this time. He did not take it well. Beaumont looked up. "There is more, but I think the point is made. Duchamp recorded your attempts to involve him in forgery, Comte Henri, and he also recorded his refusals. This would seem to exonerate him of active participation while confirming your guilt." Henri sank back into his chair, his face a mask of defeat. "I was desperate," he said again, his voice barely audible. "You cannot know what it is like, to be the younger son, to have nothing of your own, to be dependent on a brother's charity. I thought if I could raise money through the sale of a few bottles, substitute clever forgeries that might go undetected for years, I could establish myself independently, have something of my own. But I could not go through with it. I could not betray father's memory that way. And yet, Poirot said gently, someone did create forgeries, someone with the expertise and the access. If not you, Comte Henri, and if not Duchamp, as you first alleged, then who? Who has both the knowledge to create convincing forgeries and the motive to do so? The question hung in the air, unanswered. And then, quite suddenly, Comtesse Isabelle rose to her feet, her face calm, but her voice shaking slightly. I think, she said, that it is time I spoke, for I know who created the forgeries, and I know why Armand Duchamp had to die. But to explain, I must tell you a story about my father, about his wine business, and about a secret that has haunted me for 20 years. She moved to stand before the fireplace, gathering her thoughts. My father, as you know, was a wine merchant in Paris. A successful one, wealthy, respected. But what you do not know is how he achieved that success. It was not through honest trade alone. My father was a master forger, creating counterfeit wines that he sold to collectors and restaurants throughout Europe. He was never caught, never even suspected. His expertise was such that his forgeries were indistinguishable from genuine bottles.
Mon Dieu,
Philippe whispered.
You never told me this.
I could not. It was a secret I learned only shortly before his death. A confession he made to me when he thought his time had come. He made me swear never to reveal it, to protect his reputation, to spare our family the shame. And I kept that promise. Until now.
And this relates to the current situation, how?
Poirot asked, though his eyes suggested he already knew. Because, Isabelle continued, her voice strengthening, my father taught me his craft. Not intentionally, not formally, but I learned by watching, by listening, by absorbing his techniques over the years I worked in his business. I know how to create forgeries that can deceive even experts. And when I married Philippe and learned of his financial difficulties, when I saw that he was prepared to sell off the collection piece by piece, rather than face reality and sell the entire estate, I conceived a plan.
You?
Philippe stared at his wife in horror.
You created the forgeries?
Yes. I thought if I could replace the most valuable bottles with forgeries, we could sell the genuine bottles quietly, use the proceeds to settle our debts, and no one would be the wiser. The forgeries would remain in the collection, impressive to look at, but worthless in reality. And eventually, the collection could be sold en masse, with no one the wiser about the substitutions.
But Duchamp discovered what you had done, Poirot said. Is that not so?
He suspected. His examination was more thorough than I had anticipated. He found irregularities that troubled him, and I knew that if he continued his investigation, he would eventually expose me. So She stopped, her composure finally cracking. So I did what I had to do to protect my family, to protect everything we have worked for.
You murdered him, Poirot said flatly. You poisoned the wine,
knowing that his professional thoroughness would lead him to taste it.
I did what was necessary,
Isabelle cried.
He would have destroyed us. The scandal would have been catastrophic. Philippe would have been ruined. publicly humiliated. I could not allow that to happen.
And so you took a life,
Poirot said, his voice cold now.
You murdered a man to conceal your crimes, to protect your secrets. Did you not consider that murder is a far greater crime than forgery? That the blood you shed cannot be washed away by any rationalization?
The room erupted in chaos. Philippe slumped forward, his face in his hands, while Henri laughed bitterly at the irony of his sister-in-law's confession. Dr. Moreau moved to Isabelle's side, perhaps to restrain her, or perhaps simply to offer professional assessment of her mental state. But through it all, Poirot stood unmoved, his eyes fixed on the Comtesse with an expression of profound sadness.
There is one thing I do not understand,
he said finally, once the initial tumult had subsided. Why did you confess now, madame? I had not yet accused you. You could have remained silent, allowed suspicion to fall upon others. Why speak? Isabelle looked at him with eyes that were suddenly very tired.
Because I am not a monster, Monsieur Poirot. Because I love my husband, and I could not bear to watch him torment himself with suspicion and doubt. Because I thought that if I explained, if I made everyone understand why I did what I did, that perhaps they would see that I acted out of love, out of devotion, out of a desperate desire to protect those I care for most.
But you see, madame, that is where you err. Murder is never justified by love. The ends do not sanctify the means. You have taken a life, and for that, you must answer to justice. The sound of carriages on the drive announced the arrival of the police from Dijon, and Poirot went to meet them, to explain the situation, to hand over the murderess to their custody. As Isabelle was led away, Philippe followed his wife with his eyes, his expression a mixture of love, horror, and profound despair. I did not know, he said to Poirot afterward, once the police had departed with their prisoner. All these months, she was creating forgeries in my own house, using skills I did not know she possessed. And I suspected everyone, Henri, Beaumont, even Duchamp himself, everyone except the woman I had married, the woman I trusted above all others. We often fail to see what is closest to us, Poirot observed. We look outward for threats when they reside within our own homes, our own hearts. The aftermath of Isabelle's arrest brought both relief and fresh complications. The collection would need to be thoroughly examined to determine which bottles were genuine and which were forgeries. The scandal would rock the wine world, damage the Valmont reputation perhaps irreparably. But at least the truth was known, the mystery solved, the killer identified. Henri, chastened by events and by his own near destruction, approached his brother with an offer to help in whatever way he could, to repair the damage done by years of resentment and competition. I was wrong, he said simply, about so many things. Perhaps together we can salvage something from this disaster. Philippe accepted his hand, and in that gesture, Poirot saw the possibility of healing, of the family finding a way forward despite the trauma they had endured. As for René Beaumont and Claire Moreau, they emerged from the shadows with their attachment no longer secret, and Dr. Moreau, after initial resistance, gave his blessing to their union. Life is short, he said, and happiness fleeting. Who am I to stand in the way of those who have found something genuine in a world full of fraud? The next morning, as Poirot prepared to depart Château Valmont, Philippe came to see him off.
I cannot adequately thank you, Monsieur Poirot. You have saved my family from complete destruction, though at terrible cost.
I have merely revealed the truth, Monsieur le Comte. What you do with that truth, how you rebuild from this tragedy, that is in your hands now. The collection, I have decided to sell it. All of it. Once we have sorted out which bottles are genuine. The proceeds will be used to modernize the estate, to make it productive and profitable. No more living in the past, no more clinging to glory that can no longer be sustained. It is time to move forward. A wise decision, if I may say so. The past cannot be drunk like wine, monsieur. It can only be remembered, learned from, and then released. As the motorcar bore him back toward the station, Poirot looked back one last time at Château Valmont, at its elegant facade and its troubled history. How many secrets did those ancient walls hold? How many more tragedies had they witnessed over 3 centuries? But perhaps now, with truth revealed and justice served, the Valmonts could finally leave the past behind and embrace whatever future awaited them. The little grey cells had done their work, had untangled the web of deception, forgery, and murder. But Poirot felt no triumph, only the weary sadness that always accompanied such cases. For at the heart of this mystery had been not greed or hatred, but love. Twisted, desperate love that had driven a woman to terrible crimes in the name of protecting those she cherished. As the train bore him back toward Paris and the comfortable routines of his daily life, Poirot reflected on the complexity of human nature, on the capacity we all possess for both nobility and darkness. And he thought, as he had thought so many times before, that his calling was not merely to solve puzzles, but to bear witness to the human condition in all its tragedy and occasional grace. The rain had finally ceased, and as the train emerged from the Burgundy hills into flatter country, the sun broke through the clouds, casting golden light across the autumn landscape. Wine country, Poirot thought, where ancient traditions met modern realities, where the past was preserved in bottles, but could not prevent the inevitable march of change. And where, as in all human affairs, the truth eventually emerged, no matter how carefully it was hidden behind labels and lies. The case was closed. Justice had been served, and Hercule Poirot, his moustache perfectly symmetrical and his conscience clear, settled back into his seat and allowed himself the luxury of contemplating the next mystery that would inevitably present itself. For such was his destiny, to seek truth in a world of deception, to bring light to darkness, and to serve justice wherever it might lead him.